I inherited my grandmother's house in Boulder, Colorado, and what I discovered inside those walls didn't just change my life. It exposed a family's secrets so dark that my entire world shifted on its axis. This is the story of how a grandmother's love became a weapon against those who thought they could erase her legacy forever, and how I went from being the family's scapegoat to the one holding all the power. My name is Jennifer, and before I tell you what happened, I need you to understand something. If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My mother said I wouldn't even reach 1,000 subscribers, but I believe stories like this deserve to be heard. Help me show her that these tales matter. Please subscribe to Olive Revenge Stories, and let's keep breathing life into stories that were never meant to stay silent. Now, let's continue. The house wasn't supposed to be mine. That's what made everything that followed so delicious, so perfectly timed, and so absolutely devastating to the people who thought they had already won. I was 34 years old, living in a one-bedroom apartment in Denver, working as a pharmaceutical sales representative for a mid-tier company. My life was small, quiet, and honestly, I was tired of it. I was tired of my mother's subtle comments about my failed marriage to Michael, tired of my brother David's success stories about his tech startup in Silicon Valley, tired of being the one who didn't quite measure up. And I was absolutely exhausted from pretending that everything was fine when, in reality, I felt invisible in my own family. My grandmother, Margaret Hayes, was different. She was the kind of woman who made you feel seen. While my mother, Catherine, was cold and calculating, always measuring your worth by what you owned or who you knew, Grandma Margaret had this warmth that seemed to radiate from somewhere deep inside her soul. She would ask about my life, really ask, not in that performative way families do, but with genuine curiosity. She would listen to me talk about my struggles with the company's quarterly targets, my loneliness after the divorce, my fears about turning 35 without having accomplished anything meaningful. And she would look at me with this knowing smile, like she understood something I didn't yet understand about myself. When the diagnosis came, pancreatic cancer, stage 4, it hit like a tsunami that the family saw coming but nobody wanted to acknowledge. My mother immediately began the subtle dance of positioning herself as the favorite, the dutiful daughter, the one who would sacrifice everything. She rearranged her schedule to visit Grandma Margaret in her Boulder home twice a week. She posted about their time together on Facebook, carefully curated photos of them holding hands, her face turned just so to catch the best light. David called every Sunday, but his calls never lasted more than 15 minutes, and you could hear the impatience in his voice when Grandma Margaret's energy would flag and the conversation would slow. He had a product launch coming, a Series B funding round to close, a life that suddenly seemed infinitely more important than sitting with a dying woman. But my mother noticed. Oh, my mother noticed everything. She was keeping score, and she was confident that her investment of time and performative devotion would pay dividends when the will was read. I visited every other day. I didn't post about it. I didn't tell anyone at work. I just showed up at 3 in the afternoon with homemade soups from that Brazilian place she loved on Pearl Street, and I would sit with her in the sunroom that faced the Rocky Mountains. We would talk about everything: her childhood in Nashville, Tennessee, her first love before she married Grandpa Joseph, her regrets and her victories. She told me about the stock portfolio she had built quietly over 40 years, the real estate investments she had made in Austin, Texas, when nobody was watching. She told me about the money she had saved that my mother didn't know existed, money that had been growing in accounts that paid better dividends than any financial advisor my family had ever hired. And most importantly, she told me the truth about my mother. Catherine had always been obsessed with status. She had married my father, William, because his family had old money and connections to the Denver social scene. When my father had his stroke at 52, Catherine didn't grieve the man she had married. She grieved the limitations his disability placed on her social calendar. Grandma Margaret had been there when Catherine began an affair with her Pilates instructor, a man named Marcus who was 10 years younger and had nothing to offer except the excitement of feeling wanted again. Grandma Margaret had watched my mother systematically distance herself from my father in his final years, spending more nights at Denver hotels with Marcus than she did at home. And when my father died, Catherine cried at the funeral, but not for him. She cried because his life insurance policy was less than she had expected, because his medical bills had eaten into his estate, because she was going to have to actually work harder to maintain the lifestyle she had always taken for granted. She was never the daughter I hoped she would be. Grandma Margaret told me one afternoon in late September, just as the aspen trees were beginning to turn gold. But you, Jennifer, you have something she lost a long time ago. You have the capacity to actually see other people, to care about them without wanting something in return. That's rare. And I'm going to make sure it's protected. I didn't understand what she meant at the time. I thought she was just being kind, the way dying people sometimes are. They say things to make you feel better, to create a sense of closure. But I should have known better. Grandma Margaret didn't say anything without purpose. She was a woman who had built a life by making strategic decisions, by seeing 3 moves ahead, like she was playing chess, and the rest of us were still learning how the pieces moved. The will was read on a gray October morning in the office of an attorney named Patricia Chun in downtown Boulder. My mother arrived wearing black, like she was already dressed for mourning, which was convenient because it also conveyed a sense of grief-stricken dignity. David came in from San Francisco, cutting short a meeting with venture capitalists. At least that's what he claimed. And I drove up from Denver, where I had called in sick to work for the first time all year because I couldn't face pretending to be enthusiastic about pharmaceutical solutions for erectile dysfunction when my grandmother had just been buried. Patricia Chun was professional and efficient. She had that careful manner of attorneys who had delivered bad news before and knew exactly how to modulate her voice to soften the blow. She opened the document and began reading the standard language about being of sound mind and body, about the disposition of assets and the appointment of an executor. And then she got to the part that made my mother's back go rigid, her manicured hands gripping the armrests of her chair like she was bracing for impact. The house in Boulder, including all fixtures and contents, goes to Jennifer Margaret Hayes. The silence in the room was so complete that I could hear the sound of traffic on Pearl Street outside the office windows. My mother's face went through a series of expressions so quickly that if you weren't paying attention, you might have missed them. Shock, anger, confusion, and finally, a cold calculation as she recalibrated her approach. She opened her mouth, closed it, then tried again. "That must be a mistake," she said, her voice sharp and deliberate. "Margaret promised me the house. She said I would have it when she passed. We discussed it explicitly." Patricia Chun didn't flinch. She had clearly anticipated this reaction. "Your mother left a letter," she said, pulling an envelope from the file folder. "Addressed to you. Perhaps this will explain her reasoning." My mother took the envelope like it was contaminated. Her hands were shaking, actually shaking, as she opened it and read the contents. Whatever was written on those pages made her face go from red to pale in a matter of seconds. She folded the letter carefully, deliberately, and placed it back in the envelope. Then she looked at me with an expression I had never seen before, not anger, not sadness, but pure, distilled hatred. It was the look of a woman who had just discovered that someone she had underestimated had been 3 steps ahead of her the entire time. It was the look of a queen realizing that her crown had been given to someone else, and that someone else was me. "Is there anything else?" my mother asked Patricia Chun, her voice now glacially calm. "The liquid assets, approximately $2.3 million, will be divided equally between you, David, and Jennifer after taxes and estate costs," Patricia continued. "However, the house is Jennifer's exclusively, along with the contents. Your mother was quite specific about that. Jennifer, you'll also serve as executor of the estate, which means you'll manage the distribution of these assets and handle any remaining debts or obligations." David let out a low whistle. His eyes darted between my mother and me, trying to gauge how to position himself in this new dynamic. My mother was already doing the math in her head. I could see it happening behind her eyes. The house in Boulder was worth approximately $1.8 million. Add that to the $780,000 I would receive from the estate division, and suddenly I had access to resources that made me, not her, the wealthiest person in the room. My mother had always measured wealth and success as a direct correlation to her worth as a person. And now, in one stroke, her dead mother had redefined the hierarchy of our family, and she was no longer at the top. "I'd like to see that letter," I said quietly. My mother looked at me, and for just a moment, I saw something flicker in her expression. Fear.
"No," she said.
That was private correspondence between my mother and me. But Patricia Chen was already sliding another envelope across the table toward me. "Your mother left specific instructions that a copy of her letter to Catherine would be provided to you as well," she explained. "She wanted you to understand her reasoning." I opened the letter with trembling hands. My grandmother's handwriting was elegant, precise, every letter formed with intention. "Jennifer, my darling granddaughter," it began. "If you're reading this, I have already passed, and I have entrusted you with the house and the responsibility of being executor of my estate. I have done this not because I love you more than your mother or brother. Love is not a finite resource, and I love you all, but because you are the only one I trust to do what is right when nobody is watching. Your mother will be angry. She will feel betrayed. She may even try to contest the will, though Patricia has assured me that it will not hold up in court. I have included a letter for Catherine explaining my reasoning, but I suspect she will not share it with you, so I am writing this explanation for your eyes as well. Your mother has spent her entire life running from the person she is toward the person she thinks she should be. She married for status, not love. She stayed in an unhappy marriage for convenience, not commitment. She has measured her worth and the worth of others by external metrics that mean nothing in the end. And when I was dying, she did not come to say goodbye to her mother. She came to position herself for what she could gain. You, on the other hand, came to sit with an old woman who was frightened and in pain. You listened when I needed to talk. You held my hand when the medication made me confused. You asked about my life and genuinely wanted to understand it. That is the kind of person I want protecting my legacy. In the house, you will find several things that I have left specifically for you. Look in the floor safe behind the painting in the study, the landscape of the Tetons that your grandfather loved so much. The combination is your birthday, 0415. Inside, you will find documents that explain certain things about our family history that your mother does not know. Some of it may be difficult to read, but you deserve to know the truth. I am asking you to be generous with your inheritance, Jennifer, but not foolish. Your mother will try to manipulate you into giving her money, into letting her stay at the house, into giving her control over the narrative of what happens next. You must be strong. You must protect what I have given you because it represents not just financial security, but proof that goodness is worth something in this world. That seeing people, really seeing them, matters more than looking the part. I love you, my granddaughter.
Be brave.
Your Grandma Margaret. I read the letter 3 times before I looked up. My mother was watching me with an expression of carefully controlled fury. David was looking at his phone, already mentally moving on to the next thing, the next deal, the next moment of his life that he could monetize or leverage or add to his narrative of success. But I was focused entirely on that sentence. Look in the floor safe behind the painting in the study. The house in Boulder is a beautiful 1970s modern structure with floor-to-ceiling windows that face the Flatirons. My grandmother had decorated it with impeccable taste, mid-century furniture, abstract art, a kitchen that had been renovated in 2015 with Italian marble countertops and high-end appliances. It was the kind of house that made you feel like you were living inside a design magazine spread, the kind of space that seemed to contain infinite possibility. I had always loved visiting when I was young. Grandpa Joseph would grill steaks on the back patio while Grandma Margaret made her famous peach cobbler in that beautiful kitchen, and my brother and I would run through the open living space, our voices echoing off the vaulted ceilings, completely unself-conscious in our joy. I moved in on November 1st, 2 weeks after the will was read. My mother had already called me 7 times with requests. Could she stay for a few weeks while she decided what to do with her condo in Cherry Creek? Could she use the guest house, which didn't exist, for a friend who was visiting from Scottsdale, Arizona? Could I help her pay for some unexpected medical expenses related to her rotator cuff surgery? Each request was carefully framed as a temporary need, a minor inconvenience, a burden that only I could help carry because I was such a good daughter and clearly had been blessed with resources. I declined politely but firmly, and with each refusal, I could feel her rage building, like a pressure cooker that was slowly approaching its maximum capacity. That first night in the house, I made myself a cup of herbal tea and went to the study. The painting of the Tetons was hanging exactly where Grandma Margaret said it would be, a beautiful landscape rendered in shades of blue and gray and white. I lifted it carefully from the wall, and there, precisely where she had indicated, was a floor safe, its surface unobtrusive and professional. I entered the combination, 0415, my birthday, and heard the soft click of the lock disengaging. Inside the safe were documents. Lots of them. Stock certificates, real estate deeds, bank statements going back decades. But there were also photographs and letters, old ones, yellowed with age, written in handwriting I didn't recognize. I pulled them out carefully, my heart already beginning to beat faster because I could sense that I was about to learn something that would change everything. The first letter was dated March 15th, 1968, and it was addressed to my darling Margaret. It was written by a man named Thomas Chen, no relation to the attorney Patricia, I would later learn, and it detailed an affair that had been happening for 3 years, an affair that had produced a child, a daughter, who was born on April 15th, 1970. My birthday. The letter was accompanied by photographs, a young woman who looked remarkably like my grandmother, holding a baby. The baby was light-skinned, but the facial structure was distinctly Asian. The photographs were dated April 20th, 1970. And in my grandmother's writing on the back of one photo were the words, "My daughter, Jennifer. The only child I will ever truly call my own." I sat down on the floor of the study, and I stopped breathing.
No.
That couldn't be right. My mother was Margaret's daughter, wasn't she? My entire life, I had understood the family structure to be grandfather and grandmother, then my mother and uncle, then David and myself. But apparently, the structure was far more complicated than I had ever imagined. I continued reading. The documents told a story that unfolded like a mystery novel that had been carefully constructed decades ago, waiting for someone smart enough and brave enough to piece it together. My grandmother had become pregnant with my biological grandfather's youngest brother, Thomas Chen, who was Chinese-American and who had arrived at the family home in Nashville as an architect hired to design a new wing. It was 1966. She was 28 years old. Her marriage to Joseph Hayes was, by her own admission, sterile, not physically, but emotionally. They shared a home and a name and a social position, but they did not share intimacy or genuine affection. Thomas Chen was different. He saw her. He wanted her. And she wanted to be wanted. For 2 years, they conducted their affair in secret, meeting at hotels in Memphis, Tennessee, and once, memorably, in a cabin in the Smoky Mountains that Thomas had rented under an assumed name. When she became pregnant, it was not a crisis. It was a revelation. She was going to have a child with a man she actually loved, and that child would represent the only pure, untainted thing in her carefully constructed life. But society in 1970 was not prepared for a woman to have a biracial child while married to a white man. Divorce was still considered scandalous. And my grandfather, Joseph Hayes, a man with significant holdings in commercial real estate and a family name that dated back to Tennessee's founding families, would have been destroyed by the revelation that his wife had borne another man's child. My grandmother was pragmatic, even in her passion. She made a choice. She gave me up. The adoption was arranged privately through a doctor in Denver who was sympathetic to her situation. I was placed with a family named Hayes, no relation to my biological grandfather, 3 days after I was born. The adoption papers listed Margaret Hayes as the biological mother and Joseph Hayes as the biological father, a legal fiction that was not uncommon in those days, when records were less carefully scrutinized and money could make embarrassing situations disappear. I grew up thinking that Margaret and Joseph were my biological grandparents, when in fact, Margaret was my biological mother, and Joseph was a man who had never even met me until I was 5 years old. My mother, Catherine, was born 2 years later, in 1972, the product of Margaret and Joseph's marriage. She was the legitimate child, the socially acceptable one, the heir to the family name and fortune. And Margaret, my biological mother, lived her entire life with the knowledge that she had been forced to choose between her legitimate daughter and her illegitimate one. She chose Catherine because Catherine was the one who could survive in the world she and Joseph had built. But she never forgave herself for it. The letters from Thomas Chun continued through the years. He had married a woman of appropriate social standing, a Chinese-American woman named Lin, whose family owned restaurants throughout the Southwest. He had children with her, 3 of them, and they had built a life that, while it could never include Margaret openly, continued to intersect with hers in deliberate, careful ways. He paid into a trust fund that Margaret established for Jennifer, that was me, using the same account structure that allowed the money to grow without being traced to him directly. He died in 1998, at the age of 68, and his will included a substantial bequest to his dear friend Margaret Hayes, which Patricia Chun, his distant cousin, had helped him structure in a way that would not raise questions from his widow. In the safe, I found documents that told me exactly who I was. I was the biological child of Margaret Hayes and Thomas Chun, given away at birth, but never truly abandoned. Every decision my grandmother had made about her money, her house, her legacy, it had all been designed with me in mind. She had spent 54 years building a life that would eventually be my inheritance, my protection, my proof that I had always mattered, even when I had been raised by strangers who didn't know my true parentage. I found my original birth certificate, sealed in a manila envelope, with my original name written in careful letters, Jennifer Chun. I found the adoption decree that had transformed me into Jennifer Margaret Hayes, connected to a family that was not actually my family. And I found a letter from my biological mother, written in her final week of life, explaining everything and asking my forgiveness for a choice she had made to protect me, even though that protection had meant a lifetime of separation. I didn't tell anyone. Not my mother, not David, not the woman I was dating at the time, Rebecca, a human resources manager from Littleton, Colorado. I held the information inside myself like I was holding a live grenade, and I moved through my days as if nothing had changed, even though everything had fundamentally transformed. The woman I had thought was my grandmother was actually my biological mother. The man I had thought was my grandfather was actually no relation to me at all. The family I had always felt like I didn't quite belong to, I didn't belong to them, not biologically, not legally according to the original documents, and not in the way that mattered most, which was in terms of chosen loyalty and genuine affection. But the real revelation came when I began to understand what my grandmother had been trying to tell me in that final letter. She hadn't given me the house and the executor position as a gift. She had given them to me as a tool. In the safe, along with the documents about my birth, were financial records that showed exactly how my mother had been embezzling from my grandmother's accounts for the past 7 years. Small amounts, nothing so large as to trigger immediate suspicion, but systematic and deliberate. $50,000 here, $75,000 there, always withdrawn in cash, always during months when Grandma Margaret's cognitive function was declining due to medication adjustments. Catherine had stolen approximately $1.2 million from her dying mother, and my grandmother had known about it the entire time. She had documented every single transaction. She had kept receipts, photographed bank statements, recorded conversations with Catherine discussing the withdrawals. She had built an unassailable case that would prove beyond any doubt that Catherine had perpetrated elder financial abuse, and she had entrusted all of that evidence to me. Because my grandmother had been protecting me, not just from financial insecurity, but from the guilt of inherited culpability. If Catherine had inherited the house and the control of the estate, the theft would have been buried. The evidence would have disappeared. The truth would have been lost, and I would have grown up thinking my family was simply wealthy, without understanding the predatory nature of the woman at the center of it. But by giving me control of the estate, my grandmother had ensured that the truth would eventually emerge, and it would emerge on my terms, not on my mother's terms. The question was, what was I going to do with it? I spent 3 weeks processing the information. I took a leave of absence from my job. I told my boss at the pharmaceutical company that I was dealing with family matters related to the estate, which was technically true, even if the truth was far more complex than he could have possibly imagined. I sat in my mother's, beautiful house, and I thought about the woman Margaret had been. She had loved a man she couldn't have. She had given away a child to protect that child's future. She had built wealth through decades of careful decision-making. And at the end of her life, she had engineered a situation that would force her legitimate daughter to face the consequences of her choices, while simultaneously protecting her illegitimate daughter from having to carry the burden of complicity. I also found the letters from Thomas Chen's family. His children, my biological half-siblings, had discovered after his death that they had another sister, me, living somewhere in Colorado, identified only by a birth date and a trust fund. They had tried to find me through multiple channels, but Margaret had carefully obscured the trail, wanting me to come to the truth on my own terms. Now, with access to all the documents, I had their contact information, and I had a choice to make about whether to reach out to them. The answer came when I was standing in the kitchen one afternoon, making a cup of coffee in the beautiful Italian coffee maker that sat on the marble counter. My phone rang, and it was my mother. Her voice was tight and controlled, but underneath it, I could hear the panic. "Jennifer, I need to talk to you about something important," she said. "I've been thinking about the house, and I realize it's far too large for you to manage alone. I would like to suggest that I move in with you for a while. We could hire a property manager together, split the costs. It would be more economical, and honestly, I think families should support each other during this difficult time." I listened to her speak, and I realized that she was already planning her next move. She hadn't accepted that the house belonged to me. She was simply recalibrating her approach, trying a new angle of manipulation. If she could move into the house, she could establish residency. If she could claim that she had been living there for an extended period, she could potentially contest my inheritance. If she could control the narrative of the estate, she could still access what she thought belonged to her. "I'm going to need you to come to the house tomorrow," I said quietly. "I've found some things you should see. Things related to Grandma Margaret's accounts." There was a pause. I could almost hear her mind working, calculating, trying to determine whether this was a threat or an opportunity. "Of course," she said finally, her voice now carefully modulated to convey concern. "Is everything all right? Are there legal issues with the estate?" "We'll discuss it tomorrow," I said, and I hung up the phone. That night, I called Patricia Chen. "I need to talk to you about my grandmother's accounts," I said. "I've found evidence of significant fraud over an extended period. What are my options as executor?" Patricia's response was measured but clear. She had been expecting this call. Apparently, my grandmother had met with her 2 days before she died and had left additional instructions, sealed in an envelope, to be opened only if I discovered evidence of financial crime within the estate. Those instructions detailed exactly what steps I should take, what evidence I should present, and what legal remedies were available to me. My grandmother had planned for every contingency. She had known that Catherine would eventually overreach, and she had built a response that would protect both me and the truth. The next morning, when my mother arrived at the house, I was waiting for her with Patricia Chen and a folder containing the evidence of fraud. I watched as my mother's face went through the same sequence of expressions I had seen in the attorney's office weeks before: shock, anger, confusion, and finally, the cold calculation of someone trying to determine if they could talk their way out of the consequences of their own choices. "This is ridiculous," she said, her voice rising. "Those were loans. Your grandmother and I had an understanding." "There are no documentation of loans," Patricia Chen said quietly. "There are only withdrawals made by you from your mother's accounts without authorization, particularly during periods when her cognitive function was compromised by medication. That constitutes elder financial abuse under Colorado law." My mother stood up. Her face was flushed, her hands clenched into fists. "You're going to regret this, Jennifer," she said. "Both of you. I have been a devoted daughter. I have sacrificed everything for this family. And this is how you repay me? With accusations and legal threats?" "No," I said, my voice steady. "This is how we protect the truth. And this is how we honor someone who loved us enough to see us clearly, flaws and all, and still choose to invest in our futures." My mother walked out of the house without another word. Patricia Chen and I sat in the kitchen, drinking the coffee I had made before my mother arrived, and we discussed the next steps. I would not be pressing criminal charges against my mother, at least not yet. But I was freezing the portion of her inheritance that corresponded to the amount she had stolen, and I was using that money to establish a trust in my grandmother's name, designed to educate other families about elder financial abuse and help elderly women who had been victimized by family members. My mother would receive her portion of my grandmother's liquid assets, approximately $780,000, minus the amount she had stolen, which came to just over $220,000. In the end, she would receive roughly $560,000. It was still a significant inheritance, still enough to allow her to live comfortably for the rest of her life. But it wasn't the $2.3 million she had expected. It wasn't control of the family fortune. It was a punishment wrapped in the language of justice, and it was entirely legal. The story didn't end there because real life never unfolds as neatly as it does in stories. What happened next was far more interesting, far more revealing, and far more redemptive than simple revenge could ever have been. I reached out to my biological half-siblings, Jennifer's other family, the Chens who lived in Tucson and Phoenix and Las Vegas. I told them the truth about my identity, about the relationship between their father and my biological mother, about the life I had been given without knowing its true foundation. And instead of rejecting me, instead of denying the family connection, they welcomed me with a kind of joy and acceptance that I had never experienced within the Hayes family. My half-sister, Rachel, who is a lawyer in Phoenix, helped me understand the full legal implications of my status as an adoptee with access to sealed records. My half-brother, Marcus, who runs a construction company in Tucson, invited me to spend Thanksgiving with him and his family. And my youngest half-sibling, Sophie, who works in marketing for a tech company in Denver, yes, she ended up in Denver just like me, by pure chance, became my closest friend. We discovered that we shared similar tastes in music, similar senses of humor, similar approaches to problem solving. It was like finding a mirror image of yourself that you didn't know existed. The inheritance that I had thought was just about money and property became something far more valuable. It became a bridge to a family I had never known I was supposed to have. My grandmother, my biological mother, had structured everything not just to protect me financially, but to create the conditions under which I would eventually discover my true identity and my true family. She had been playing the longest game of chess imaginable, moving pieces across decades, arranging for my protection and reunion with the people I should have known all along. As for my mother, Catherine, she did eventually reach out. It took 8 months, but one afternoon in July, she called me at the house in Boulder and asked if she could come by. I agreed, more out of curiosity than anything else. I wanted to understand her reasoning, her mindset, what had driven her to steal from a dying woman. I was angry, she told me, sitting in the same chair where I had confronted her with the evidence of her theft. I spent my entire life trying to live up to your grandmother's expectations, trying to be the perfect daughter, the perfect wife, the perfect mother. And it never mattered. Nothing I did was ever good enough. She never looked at me the way she looked at you.
She didn't know me, I said.
Not really. Not until the end. Exactly, my mother said, and for the first time, I saw something other than calculation in her expression. I saw genuine pain. She spent her whole life with me, and she didn't know me. And she spent the end of her life with you, and suddenly you were everything. It wasn't fair. I thought about that for a long moment. No, I agreed. It wasn't fair. But not in the way you think. It wasn't fair to any of us. It wasn't fair to Grandma Margaret that she was forced to give up her firstborn child to protect her marriage and her reputation. It wasn't fair to you that you grew up with a mother who was always emotionally distant, always regretting the choice she had made. And it wasn't fair to me that I was adopted and given a family history that wasn't actually mine. Did you know, my mother asked suddenly, about the adoption, about Thomas Chun, about all of it? When you confronted me with the evidence of the theft, did you already know the truth about who you were? No, I said honestly. I found out the same time you did, but I had already found out everything else. So it didn't feel as shocking to me as it was to you. My mother nodded, and something seemed to collapse inside her. Not her body, but her entire framework of understanding about how the world worked. For the first time, she was confronting the reality that her actions had consequences, Not because some external authority was punishing her, but because the person she had tried to manipulate had simply become more powerful than she was. "I'm sorry," she said, and I believed her. Not because her apology absolved her of what she had done. It didn't, but because it seemed to come from a place of genuine understanding that she had been wrong. "I accept your apology," I said, "but I'm not giving you the money back. And I'm not going to pretend that what you did didn't happen. You're going to have to live with the consequences of your choices, the same way I've had to live with the consequences of mine." "What about the house?" she asked. "Is there any chance that you would ever sell it?" "Maybe," I said. "Not right now, but maybe someday. Right now, I'm still figuring out who I am in it. I'm still learning what it means to be Jennifer Chunhays, the daughter of a woman I never knew I was supposed to be, the sister of people I just met, the heir to a legacy I never expected to inherit. So I'm going to live here for a while, and I'm going to remember who this woman was, who put me in this house, and what she was trying to teach me." My mother left, and I didn't see her again for 6 months. When she did resurface, it was in the form of a postcard from Santa Fe, New Mexico, where she had moved with Marcus, her Pilates instructor, and where she was apparently rebuilding her life with the resources she had left. I thought that was probably for the best. The story has a real ending now. I still work in pharmaceutical sales, though I've moved to a company that specializes in treatment for pancreatic cancer, in honor of the woman who gave me my life and took her own chances to protect me. I'm using the house in Boulder as a retreat center, where I host small conferences for families dealing with elder care issues, inheritance disputes, and the kind of complicated family dynamics that most people don't want to talk about but everyone experiences in some form. Sophie Chun, my half-sister, now works for the same company. We've become the kind of family that my grandmother wanted to exist all along, one based not on obligation or blood relation, but on choice, on genuine affection, on seeing each other clearly, and deciding that we want to be in each other's lives. Rachel and Marcus are part of our chosen family too, and we gather in the Boulder house 4 times a year for what we call Margaret's Legacy Weekends, where we discuss the issues that matter to us and remember the woman whose choices made our connection possible. My mother and I have a relationship now, but it's different. It's built on honesty rather than performance. She knows that I know the truth about her, and that knowledge has freed us both from the exhausting work of maintaining appearances. She's happier now, actually, in a way she never was when she was trying to maintain her social standing in Denver. She teaches a yoga class in Santa Fe, and apparently she's quite good at it. I'm genuinely glad for her. But the most important thing I learned from this experience is something my grandmother tried to tell me in that final letter, that seeing people, really seeing them in their fullness and their brokenness and their potential, matters more than anything else. My grandmother spent her entire life with a secret, carrying the weight of a choice she had made to protect people she loved. And at the end of her life, she made another choice, to entrust that secret to someone who would understand it, who would use it not for revenge, but for truth. This inheritance wasn't just about money or property, or even about justice. It was about legacy. It was about proving that our actions matter, that our choices ripple forward through time, that the invisible work we do to protect people we love eventually becomes visible, becomes real, becomes the foundation upon which entire lives are built. If you're listening to this story right now, I want you to think about the choices you're making. I want you to think about who you're protecting and who you're deceiving, and whether those 2 categories might sometimes be the same person. I want you to think about what legacy you're building, not in terms of money or status, but in terms of truth and connection and genuine affection. Because at the end of the day, that's all that really matters. That's the story of how I discovered who I really was by inheriting the house of a woman I never knew was my mother. And it changed everything.